say, first, thank you very much for inviting me. I feel a very slight fraud, although not quite as much as I thought I was going to feel, if you know, because of, I wish Louise had stayed, because I want to just throw in one other bit about my multifarious, complicated CV, which links to, you know, how old and not wise I am, which is that I currently chair the Children's Services Improvement Board in Cornwall. And one of the things we had last week at the Improvement Board meeting was a report on their Troubled Families programme. And I would have loved to talk to her, and I'm actually glad she's going to see Claire Gerard, because one of the biggest challenges we faced was that in Cornwall there is no designated doctor. Now, for those of you who know the intricacies of the safeguarding world, which I don't claim to be an expert in, but which I've been coasting around for the last few years, a designated doctor is a requirement. They have a designated doctor in Cornwall, but the person doesn't really want to be it, they've already retired, they do 1 day a week on a good week, etc., etc. This is not the way to drive an engaged GP world in a very dispersed county, which is just moving to clinical commissioning through the clinical commissioning group. And there are undoubtedly, and this is not because there's malice aforethought amongst the 71 GPs practices in Cornwall, but there is a very deep culture, I think it's fair to say, about patient confidentiality in the health profession, and you need to do more about it than just saying it's a bad thing. You've got to find some ways around it. So I would have liked to have had a version of that debate with Louise, but not now. So I'm now going to move back to what I think you wanted me to talk about, although I think it is interesting, the kind of the theme she picked out. So, as I say, thank you very much for inviting me. There's many people in this room, both who've been involved in actually doing the work on the report, but also who've got at least as much experience or more than I've got. But what I wanted to kind of try and pick up was a sort of, to both really welcome the work of the report and to put down, I think, some challenges, which are kind of collective challenges, because what I thought is very impressive about the report is he's clearly done a lot of serious going behind the scenes about what the systems are that actually make the public spending environment in which we operate. I don't mean the fiscal and monetary environment, I mean the kind of ways in which that system operates. And there was a period in the early 2000s, and it wasn't all giving away the money, let me just assure you. There was a period when I was Director of Public Services at the Treasury, and I had quite an interesting engagement with that across a number of major departments, including the DFES, as it then was called, and the ODPM, CLG, which went through at least 4 names during the 3.5 years, I think, that I was in central government, and DEFRA, which is an interesting one, which was called MAF, but then became called DEFRA while I was there. DCMS, also interesting. I remember the Commonwealth Games, the issues around that, and the whole build-up to the Olympics. And I don't think it would be a secret to say there were some real tensions about the amount of investment that was going to be planned to go into the Olympics, and the ways in which many resources, the lottery would be one, but of course a lot of regeneration money was locked into the Olympics. And it's an interesting question about what are considered to be okay long-term programs and what are considered to be not okay long-term programs. So this is absolutely, as David has said, an issue whose, you know, if this isn't the burning platform in terms of the overall economic and public finances context, I don't know what is. And I think the kind of the 6 obstacles that have been identified in the report and in this kind of summary are very relevant, and I want to just sort of touch on them in different ways. So the first one, thinking and planning is short term, absolutely right. And my point would be there's something that doesn't really come up enough, I think, in the analysis, which is it's something called politics, by which I don't actually mean party politics per se, although party politics is absolutely relevant, but it is a really important question. I used to be Chief Executive of Bristol City Council, which bizarrely, as when it became a unitary council in the mid-90s, ended up, because it had come out of Avon County Council, it had elections 3 years out of 4. Let me tell you that running an organisation with the then a revenue budget of 600 million, which has, and 400,000 population, which has elections of 1/3 of the council every year, is a complete nightmare. And proof positive was that for many, many years during the first decade of this century, last decade, Bristol actually failed to have a political administration. I don't mean it had a coalition, I meant it failed to have a political administration. And it creates the most extraordinary sense of stasis. Anybody says anything and immediately, you know, you're going to have a go at it. And it creates a really, really unhappy way of doing business. I am passionate about the importance of democracy and elections and representative, but we've got to think about a better way of doing it. And I have to say, there was then a very senior politician, splendid woman of enormous whatever, who argued firmly for annual elections and that we all should be doing it. And I think there's a real issue we need to think about that. And I use that as an example because you cannot ignore politics. And even in the borough, which I know David knows very, very well, lives and works in and has done for many, many years in Newham, which is essentially a one-party administration, politics has a role to play. And that is important and positive and part of democracy. But we do need to think about that in the context of these systems. The second thing about the thinking and planning is about language, and we've already had examples of it. I think one of the really important issues around language, and it was something I've really experienced moving sectors, but also moving roles, if I can call it that, which is the concept of time. I think time means something very, very different if you're briefing a minister for appearing in Parliament tomorrow, or if you're briefing or trying to create a 10-year strategic plan or a 20 or 30-year strategic plan for carbon reduction to hit carbon reduction targets for 2020 or 2030 or whatever it might be. Or if you're in the MOD and you're investing in substantial equipment. I had a brief period when I was actually responsible for MOD expenditure, not personally, but at a strategic level. And the kind of debates you have there, the lead-in times, the design times, everybody knows that to get your fighter, whatever it is, or your submarine, whatever it is, and it takes a long time, and this is a very complex process. We've already had the example of the Olympics. So time is not a neutral concept. And the other issue is, and Louise, I think, reflected it very powerfully, is she rightly has an absolute passion, as many of us who work in this field do, for working to actually make a difference to real children right now, in that room around the corner, in the school down the road, in that family, in the estate, or indeed in the country, wherever they are. We know that we want to make a difference right now, but the reality, and we also know if you are looking to get your kid into the right school, you're trying to sort out the damp in your house, you're trying to sort out your benefit, you would like it sorted out not just right now, you'd like to have had it sorted out yesterday. So we have to understand that some of the pressures are very different. There's very instantaneous pressures, and we need to find ways of having a system that actually can recognise that and manage it. And many of the ways we actually use bits of the system, including people like social workers, I would suggest, but many other people as well, is not only are they people who are gatekeepers, but they're also managers of that time concept. I spent many happy hour in the many years ago. I used to work for a housing advice organisation, and issues of time, when you were talking to the DWP, when you were talking to the housing department, when you were talking to the frustrated and depressed and worried tenant and parent, were very, very different. So it's quite reasonable. I'll get back to you next week. No, it isn't. So those concepts are really important, and to understand how different organisations at different moments and different people in different roles use things like time, as I say, concepts of language. The second thing I want to talk about is silos, and a point that Louise made, and that I think is sort of reflected in the report, but I think we just need to really, really think about hard, is this has not been an issue that just became an issue in the last few years. There have been many, many attempts to think about how you deal with silos, and it's a bit like restructuring of organisations, and I've gone through more restructurings and more refocusing and more modernisation of organisations than you would want to think about. And as we all know, that structure of itself is not a solution, but structures can help and they can hinder. And I'll just give you an example. I was talking on this same issue of children's services improvement, as it happens, and I said to a very good colleague in the DFE, who's very committed to this agenda, who leads the intervention team there, I said to him, so what's the ministerial arrangement for making the link on safeguarding across the silo of health, I didn't call it that, the silo of health, the silo of the DWP, which is now really crucial for the troubled families, and so on and so forth. I have to say that CLG is probably, at this moment in time, the least critical bit, except for housing, for many of those families. You know, the whole criminal justice system, the benefit system, all of that are actually much more crucial. And the answer was, well, he wasn't really quite sure. And then he kind of sent me after an NHS safeguarding document in draft to advise the new clinical commissioning groups about how they would address safeguarding issues, which was still waiting for the main document to come out from the DFE, working together, or whatever it is called, between families, which still hasn't been issued. So some of these things are very real and could be sorted, actually, in my view, in real time. Some of these things are systemic, but what we have to understand is that the silos also have a basis in the political system. And cabinet government isn't called cabinet government for no reason. And you do need some systems that actually politically, so in my day, and I'm sure there are versions of it under the current government, but there were cross-departmental cabinet committees. Some of them were more effective than others. Some of them were chaired in more effectively than others. But as officials, if you've got one of these things, it does drive the shape of how you operate. I'm trying to go through this relatively quickly. I hope that's all right. The third point you've got is can't afford critical shift of resources. And I say, I mean, my view is that is absolutely a classic argument, which we all have had to handle in real time, and which is explicitly about also creating a dialogue. And this takes me to a central plank of what I ought to be saying and what I want to be saying, coming from my current role at Community Service Volunteers, which is sometimes in these conversations you do get a feeling that the citizen and civil society are sort of an add-on, and civil society, let us be clear, is not the voluntary sector. The voluntary sector is part of civil society, but so are many other organisations, and so are kind of activists within civil society and the citizenry. And one of the concerns I've got is that the debate about the critical shift of resources has got to be a debate that is a debate that includes both the state and the market and civil society. And if I was going to be a little critical of the kind of analysis, I think that civil society as a phenomenon doesn't really engage with some of the things you're saying. And why I think that's really important is because some of the concepts which are probably old language, and I'm afraid I'm not up to speed to what the new language is, but notions of co-design, co-production, which are both become things like personalisation, but they're not just about personalisation. A different way of doing business in the second decade of the 21st century than we would have done when I first started 40 years ago, or whatever, at work, I think must be at the centre of what we're doing. So that the notion that this is not all about creating visions of services and investments that are entirely determined by experts and professionals, but they need to be shaped by that kind of dialogue. And I think you have an interesting example in the report about, at the end of the day, some of the difficult debates, which, to be fair, my impression was that Professor Darzi had started. Some of the debates about health provision are ones that are really difficult because individuals and families and people feel very strongly about their local health provision, and they feel it's a really big loss when it goes. In some cases, that just isn't realistic if you're going to start to shift resources. But you need to have that debate, and the big lesson, and I've closed more libraries and looked at swimming pools than you'd want to think about, and they are the worst and most difficult things to change in the local government scenario, is you have to demonstrate how you were going to do that reinvestment now, not necessarily have done it all, but you've got to make some clarity about your reinvestment in services now, so people can understand how they're going to deal with what they've lost. So moving on very fast, not really knowing what works on the ground. I mean, I think that's really true, but it's also a bit like my concept of language. What I accept as being a good valuation, what other people accept as a good valuation, is often very different. Politicians kind of reject what happened last time. Nobody actually reads half the evaluations that are done, and I think there's a whole issue about evaluations that are also done across the silos, and I know there's much more work going on that, but that's a really important question. Don't have the skills to work differently. I mean, I think that's both true, and again, there have been many, many attempts over the last 10, 15, 20 years to think about this. And it's an interesting question, is both needing the skills to work in partnership or to work with others or to understand how to engage with a range of professionals is really important. But also the skills of actually doing your job. And I still think that, and it's interesting that Louise didn't mention it, and I'll just use one link which I think is important in terms of where there are serious proposals for system change, we all need to agree them. So the Munro work on social work is absolutely crucial. It's probably the single most important thing that has happened in children's social work in the last 10, 15 years. And that is all about proper decision making and people being properly supported in their professional job and other people working with and around that. And I think valuing professional expertise is something we're actually extremely bad at doing in this country and extremely bad at doing across the piece. And we need to do that appropriately. That's not saying they have some God-given right because I'm a doctor, social worker, you know, whatever it is, priest, I have nobody can challenge me, teacher. But it's about saying there needs to be proper respect and understanding for the roles I play. And finally, the point about leadership and determination, which is, you know, one of the things that passionately that Louise also talked about. I mean, I absolutely agree about that. But it's also about how the system, and it goes back to my earlier point about who are the politicians that long-term we actually end up admiring or end up feeling have really made a difference. And this could be both locally and nationally. Or who are the people? It's the people who've got a clear passion and who drive it through. But they have to do that on the basis of evidence and a basis of evaluation. And I think we need to recognise that the nature of leadership is not, it's not all about the Napoleonic, you know, charging on with the white charger at the front of the troops. A lot of leadership is about distributed leadership. It's about people feeling confident in what they do and feeling confident that they will be supported to do the difficult things. So, if I can say, I think this kicks off some very important stuff. I think that the things you're proposing, the 10-year stuff, is really valuable. But I think we need to think about what are the conditions that are going to make it more likely that people are going to engage with that rather than less likely. Thank you very much.